que muy sentida y muy guajira alegre cantó.
Bolender from Canada, the journalist and author. And we're here for the launch of your book today, Cuba Under Siege, American Policy, the Revolution and Its People. Okay, can you give us just a brief description of what brought the book about?
Thank you for having me. The book is an examination of how American policy of aggression, of regime change, has affected Cuban society, the culture, the economics, and the individual Cuban. The book was written with the perspective of that American policy has helped create a siege mentality among the Cuban government officials and the Cuban citizens. So it looks at how negatively American strategy of regime change has affected the revolution. And American policy of aggression started almost immediately after the triumph of the revolution. And it's dealt with various elements. The economic embargo is the most obvious one, but that's only a part of it. There's been a long unknown history of terrorism against Cuban civilians done by Cuban American organizations in Miami, a lot of the time with the support of the American government. There's also been propaganda, nonstop propaganda. The Cuban government has been put in a situation where they've been constantly having to defend themselves against so many misconceptions and untruths from the American media, the American politicians. There's also been isolation. In the early years of the revolution, America tried to isolate Cuba from the rest of the world. There's also been situations where American laws have had extraterritoriality effects, where subsidiaries, I'm from Canada, there's Canadian companies that want to do business in Cuba but can't because of American laws preventing them. So all these elements have gone into make what I propose in the book, the development of a siege mentality, and just how the Cuban government has tried to protect itself and its citizens from American aggression. And part of the method they've done that is through security, surveillance systems, being very defensive, very sensitive to criticism. And all these aspects have influenced the revolutionary society, has influenced the individual Cuban. And so the book examines from a historical perspective, as well as the millions of dollars being spent in the United States to maintain the siege, and the current situation, and it reflects on what hopefully will happen in the next few years.
And I think most people throughout the world, when with the election of Obama as president, thought that there was a new liberal regime coming in America, but as we've seen, that doesn't seem to be the case, and it certainly isn't the case with Cuba. Is there any intentions on Obama's behalf to change the attitudes toward Cuba?
Obama's very interesting because before he was elected, he publicly stated and wrote about his opinions about Cuba. And he basically came out and said, American policy against Cuba has been a failure. The embargo, the aggression has done nothing except isolate America from Cuba and the rest of the world opinion. So there was tremendous expectation that Obama was going to change things, that he was going to engage the Cubans with the hope of actually starting a process of normalization of relationships between Cuba and the United States. And he made it very clear before he was elected this was his intention. So he gets elected, and as what happens is the office controls the man doesn't control the office. He became president. The pressures became the opinions, the expectations, and he became just the latest in a long line of presidents that stated Cuba has to do these things. Cuba has to change before we consider normalization. He has done some things. He allowed Cuban Americans to travel to Cuba without restrictions. He's increased licensed travel for Americans to go to Cuba. He's done some positive things. He's also done some very negative things. In fact, in some ways, he's increased the pressure on Cuba. He's made it more difficult in some aspects of the economic embargo. So the expectations of Obama, and there was high expectations in Cuba, they've pretty well been ended simply because now he's in his second year and he's still taking the same perspective of every American president since the revolution is Cuba has to change. Cuba has to make all these concessions before America will even consider normalization. And that's the same line that every American president has had.
Didn't the Cuban government respond to that call for change in Cuba by holding a referendum on the nature of the state and asking the Cuban people, do they want socialism or do they want an alternative? And they overwhelmingly voted for socialism.
Yeah, and they've gone through some fairly substantial economic changes based on a survey that was conducted under Raul Castro about 4 or 5 years ago. The Cubans understand the American embargo is maintaining, the siege is maintaining, and they're doing their best to overcome it, and they're following their own path. And they've recognized there has to be some changes in the Cuban economic structure, and they've made those changes, including, one of the major ones was the plan to release more than 1 million workers from the public sector into the private sector. And then they've had other minor economic changes, and it's also affected some of the political aspects of the Cuban society. They're not doing it because the Americans are saying, okay, if you make these changes, then we'll start talking normalization, because they've been down that road many, many times. They're doing it because they understand that their society needs to be updated. Their economic model has to be improved, and that's why they're doing it. If the Americans respond, and so far they haven't, great. If they don't, that's not going to change the momentum of the Cuban reforms.
Okay, you've obviously done a lot of research in Cuba itself with Cuban people. What is the ordinary Joe Soap in Cuba, the ordinary Cuban? What is his attitude towards America? I know you said they understand the embargo, but like on day-to-day basis, how does it affect them?
It's interesting because there's a vast majority of Cubans who have been born after the revolution, so they know no other perspective. And the book talks about the internalization of the embargo. You talk to an average Cuban, and more often than not, they won't even recognize the impact that the American policies continue to have on Cuban society and Cuban economy, because sometimes it's easier just to blame the government for the shortcomings without understanding the reason behind it. So it's interesting. The Cubans are very excited about the reforms that are taking place. The majority still support the government, the leadership, and want to improve things within their social political structure. You talk about the Americans, and of course they want the Americans to come. They want the travel restrictions that the United States government has placed on their own citizens to end, so the American tourists can come to Cuba and see for themselves what everything is about. And they certainly want the economic exchanges. But it's difficult sometimes to talk to even the Cubans about, well, you understand your day-to-day life is still being affected by this policy of aggression, that the Americans still want regime change. They don't want reform. They want to change things entirely. And it's interesting, the younger generation obviously has a different perspective. The younger generation in Cuba has a different perspective than the older generation. And it's even harder to talk to the younger generation of Cubans to let them understand and recognize how much damage American policy is still doing to Cuban society.
And just finally, Keith, you referred earlier to acts of terrorism against the Cuban government, the Cuban people, and as a direct result of that, at present there was 5 Cubans incarcerated in American jails for activities they carried out to counter the terrorist attack. Is there any leeway in America on this position? Is there going to be a release date for the Cuban 5?
You're referring to the Cuban 5, one who's been released and is now living in Cuba. The average American has no idea who they are. The Cuban voice is not heard in the United States. So if an American even knows of the Cuban 5, their default position is, well, they were spies, they got what they deserved. There's very little judicial maneuverability left. It's gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to hear it. There's a movement now to show that there was total bias even before the trial started, because a number of journalists in Miami were paid by the U.S. government to write negative stories about the 5. What the solution will be is a political solution, because the case of the Cuban 5 is becoming more and more well known internationally. There's becoming more pressure put on But the American government's position is they were spies, they were caught, that's their message, even though these were intelligence agents trying to prevent acts of terrorism. So it's very difficult to move that position unless you've got even greater international pressure and awareness. Yeah.
Keith, thanks very much. It looks like a fascinating read. I haven't got a chance to read it yet myself, but I'm certainly looking forward to it. Keith, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yo soy guajiro y carretero, y en el campo vivo bien, que soy guajiro y carretero, y en el campo vivo bien, porque